So it's 1:30. I'll go ahead and kick it off. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining our Day of Security session on building an identity security strategy that scales. My name is Shelley, and I'm a product manager at Opal Security. Prior to this, I worked as a security engineer in areas such as security operations, cloud infrastructure security, Kubernetes security. And so these are all surfaces where managing identity and least privilege were crucial. So I'm very excited to be talking with you all about this. And with that, I'll pass it on to my co-speaker, Umaimah, for her introduction.
Hey everyone, I'm Umaimah. I am the founder and CEO of Opal Security. I started off life a long time ago as a cryptographer and found my way into the wild world of internal tooling for access management. Built at a couple of startups, which led me to want to build a company in the space. And we are going to talk to you about some of the lessons Shelley and I have learned as practitioners about how to build an identity security strategy that scales.
Thank you, Umaimah. So the rough agenda for today is to go over the importance of an identity security strategy, aka managing least privilege. And we'll talk about how to implement this scalably, discuss human versus non-human identities, and highlight how security teams can and should be empowering partner teams to implement best practices.
Alrighty,
on to you, UK.
Okay, so there are a couple of stats up here that I'm sure everyone is very, very familiar with at this point. For those of you in the room, I'm sure you're probably very, very tired of hearing identity is the new perimeter, and this is the problem, and oh, it's an OWASP top 10 threat. So I wanted to actually take a step back and talk about how we got here. So I don't think anyone disputes that it's a bit of a mess and it's a bit of the Wild West. But this is, sort of the result of just life and how fast technology moves. So, we can kind of break this down into a couple of eras. In the early 2000s, basically, we all operated on-prem. We had hardware appliances. And what this meant was when we thought about security, network security was king. We thought about firewalls, we thought about antivirus, we thought about network intrusions, we thought about DLP. It was very, very structured and tied to the physical hardware of how we computed. And then in the 2010s, we started moving everything to cloud. Software started eating the world, APIs started eating the world. And what happened as a result of that was we had this absolute explosion of web application, right? We started making all of these SaaS apps, and we started to sort of, just accelerate how quickly we moved businesses along by creating these applications and how quickly we grew the size of these organizations as well. And when thinking about security in this era, a lot of point solutions were built with a lot of really great intentions. So we have like a lot of great auth protocols. We have SSO, we have SAML, we have SCIM, we have MFA. And these technologies are good, but the pace of business was so fast that none of these actually got applied in a consistent manner, right? Like even today, when we build applications like internally, for example, they maybe eventually end up becoming enterprise ready, or they go behind an SSO flow or something like that. But most of the time, in this era, development just picked up so quickly that it was hard to sort of consistently apply and centralize some of these best practices on the auth end side. And then, Auth Z was kind of off in its Wild West. Everyone was just building whatever they needed to build based on their business logic and how they knew people access these applications. And then we entered sort of this kind of phase where we were like, okay, well, what can we do with all of these APIs? We'll move to endpoint detection. So we talked a lot about securing things at the endpoint level. And this is kind of the era we were in until we had another shift again in the 2020s. And now we're multi-cloud, we're multi-identity, and software development itself, it's early, but I think we all agree is fundamentally changing. Now, with AI, how you actually develop software, it's early, but it has fundamentally changed. And the ways in which it has changed is we no longer are just gluing APIs together. We're actually doing prompt engineering. We're testing things with PII. We have all of these emergent properties, these multi-identities. And so now everything has turned into all data security and all identity security. And a lot of folks have kind of sort of approached the data security problem because, as you recall, in the 2000s, we still understood that this was a problem. But identity is just the Swiss cheese. It's like the absolute Wild West between Auth-N and Auth-Z, and we have this crazy identity stack, and businesses aren't slowing down. And all we have at our disposal are these legacy solutions with these funny 3-letter acronyms for increasing complexity and velocity. And where does that leave us? basically without an identity strategy that scales. And I'll pass it over to you, Shelley.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks, Umaimah, for highlighting how the landscape has changed over the years and for describing the identity challenges at a macro level. So what does that mean concretely for organizations? Every company is at a different stage of their identity security journey, so it can be very overwhelming for a team to figure out where to even start. So as a framework, we've roughly separated a company's identity security journey into 3 phases. We have the identify, centralize, and optimize phases. So going from left to right, from less mature to more mature, with identify, this is all about building the foundations. It's about identifying your source of truth for workforce provisioning, inventory your crown jewels, understanding what are my critical and most sensitive resources. In the second bucket, this is the centralized phase. So here it's really about integrating and applying your best practices universally. So these best practices could be multi-factor authentication, single sign-on, applying just-in-time access instead of granting perpetual access and granting it only on a need basis. This is also where you're talking about managing both human and non-human identities in one place. I'll go into that in a little bit. And fanning out, this is culturally where we're talking about training employees to request access from one place. And moving on to the next bucket, optimize. This is geared towards more mature organizations. At this phase, you're thinking about using logs and data to apply detection and response capabilities. So was this event anomalous? Was this behavior that we were expecting? And at this phase, you're also talking about supporting continuous and conditional access. An example, people always talk about, defense in depth or layering in that security. So let's say at the stage you have PCI servers that are in scope. You might want to layer on extra controls for these types of servers. So these are stages where you can really add that extra layer. At this point, you may also want to be generating recommendations using contextual data and behavioral analysis, eliminating weak points like passwords, one-off IAM roles, and also centralizing authorization policies. So while this is generally the maturity flow that we see organizations strive for, realistically in practice, I'm sure like UK has seen this, I've seen this. I've seen companies of small, medium, large size start at the end. Sometimes that's due to last minute compliance obligations, top-down directives, and a lot of times it's sort of just out of the security team's control. And as a security engineer myself, what I've seen with the struggle here is that by starting at the end without having built out that strong foundation, it's much more difficult to scale out an identity strategy. And it can really feel like playing whack-a-mole. And this is why internally we think about this as like a phased journey and really having to set those foundations before building on top of it.
Yeah, folks, I'm sure you're looking at different things here and you're probably getting PTSD like Shelley and I did. As sort of like a personal anecdote, once upon a time, I thought about solving for things at the authorization policy layer. I was convinced that I was going to create the world's greatest authorization language and it would solve all of my problems. And what I realized was I only had a limited understanding of the ways in which people were changing around and moving and changing like their access. And to Shelley's point, it really was this core insight, especially for us at Opal Security, where if we want to get to a future where we really can optimize for context and signals, we have to kind of build this contextual foundation, this architecture, this infrastructure that really allows us to set the foundations to centralize and apply these different technologies in a way such that we then have an understanding of how a unique business moves around with respect to authorization.
Absolutely. And so one more thing I want to highlight here is the dichotomy of human versus non-human identities. So as a bit of background, non-human identities, this space is not really well-defined, and it's really growing as more companies build out more infrastructure. And so one of the stats that CyberArk quotes is that for every one human identity in an enterprise, there are roughly 45 non-human identities. Just let that sit in for a little bit. Just think of the potential sprawl that you can get out of that. So today we sort of understand what human behavioral patterns are like, but we don't have a clear understanding on the emergent properties and full blast radius of non-human identities. Some of the differences I'll call out here manifest more in behavioral patterns. So when you think human versus non-human, some examples might be you wouldn't expect, let's say, a service account to have a browser interaction, whereas seeing that from a human would make sense. You might expect a service account to hit an API 100 times in a minute, but coming from a human, that's a little eyebrow raising. Right? So I bring this up because even though there are these differences, when we think holistically about identity security, we do have to consider all of the entry points regardless of the type of identity. And so this is why UK and I here are calling it the false dichotomy, right? So identities with edges to access to resources can be human or non-human. The same way a human has access to an S3 bucket, or let's say like a Salesforce role, a Snowflake data set, a server or a pod may also have access to this S3 bucket and to these resources. So if we're thinking about zooming back out to actionable items, this is why inventorying, centralizing, and gathering insights on all types of identities is so important in an org's journey towards maturity. And now I'll hand it off to UK again to talk about how the how piece of scaling.
Thanks, Shelley. Well, before we do that, you're so sincere, Shelley. I was just like, basically everyone, the hordes are coming. Everyone is like building in the hype cycle, and we're going to have co-pilots everywhere with OAuth tokens. And we're all just, we have no idea what they're doing. If anyone knows what they're doing, like, please do tell me. But like, I'm just assuming this is like microservices landed like the last like 7 years ago, where you just like, the service accounts, they've gone crazy. But to Shelley's point, you know, that is sort of one of the big like transformational shifts that's happening. Just like cloud was a big shift. The way people develop software is going to change, and you still fundamentally need to understand what is going on the identity stack. Switching it over to the more human side of things, another core principle we think a lot about at Opal Security is the fact that identity is like very unique in that it will always be people, process, and technology, an emphasis on people and process. And I call this a little bit of the GitHub play. Sometimes I like to remind people that we think about GitHub as a tool for developer productivity, but like fundamentally, GitHub is a supply chain tool and is a compliance tool. For those of us in the room who've ever run UARs and had to explain to an auditor how our software development lifecycle is captured, and we passive aggressively post a link to a PR, that's basically that's an audit, folks. Like, I'm just saying, and that's not a bad thing. Like, compliance is not a dirty word, and when done well, products like these also establish a source control in a repository that people actually trust, that is transparent, that lets them do their jobs, and then, as we said earlier, have those centralized and optimized phases and grow this culture of hygiene and responsibility. It just makes people's lives easier. In the same way, it would be absolutely nuts at this point to probably email your code to a coworker. You know, there's a world in which we can get there with things like access management, where it's so much easier to use a product that actually gives you all of the context necessary and helps sort of delegate out responsibility to the right folks that you would never consider, like slacking your friend to paste over a password or an API key. So this is really, I think, one of the more unhighlighted parts of identity security, in that it's, in more than any other form of security today, it really does require bringing everyone on board and making it everyone's responsibility, but also incentivizing folks by building a good product. Like, it deserves a good product. So I'll leave it at that. And we have a couple of minutes, I think, just to take questions if folks have any. Oh, no, we have a summary. Shelley, you want to kick it off with the summary?
Yep, sounds good. Yeah, so just to summarize what we've talked about, we really want to put a nail in the coffin in terms of how to think holistically about identity security, right? You want to start with a foundation of least privilege. You want to make it actionable and future-proof. And that's when we walk through the 3 phases of identify, centralize, and optimize. And in terms of rolling out to the organization, again, UK just talked about how we really want to partner with stakeholders and incentivize them to also help scale out security outcomes. The more signals we have and the more usage we have, the more context that we have on access within our organization. And that will lead us to better observability and a stronger strategy overall. So that's just to sum up everything. And yes, we do have a couple of minutes for questions if anyone wants to chime in or jump in. A comment from Chantel. The slide with different swim lanes covering increments resonated a lot with me. Just wanted to say thank you for breaking things down so well. Thank you. Appreciate it. Okay. Well, if there are no more questions, we do still have a few minutes, but don't want to keep folks here. Here's a contact slide if you're interested to learn more, just want to talk about identity security or security in general. Feel free to reach out to Umaimah and myself. Here's our LinkedIn information. You can also reach us through Opal Security. I believe the email is hello@opal.dev. Yeah, don't be shy. Feel free to reach out.
Bye, folks.
Thank you.